The great hall of Babylon was silent, except for the shallow, ragged breaths of the man who had once been the most powerful figure on earth. Alexander the Great, the unstoppable conqueror whose armies had marched across continents, lay sprawled on a golden bed, his skin pale and slick with sweat. Around him stood his generals, his companions, and his supposed friends. Their faces were carefully neutral, but behind their controlled expressions burned ambition, fear, and for at least one of them, triumph. The empire Alexander had built stretched from Greece to India, a realm so vast that no map of the time could fully capture it. He had toppled the mighty Persian Empire, crushed kingdoms thought unconquerable, and declared himself divine. To the world, Alexander was a god king, a living legend. Yet here he was, barely able to speak, his once mighty body racked with fever. The empire's fate balanced on a knife's edge, and no one knew who would inherit his throne, or so it seemed. But as history would later whisper, Alexander's death was no accident. The seeds of his downfall were planted long before that fateful night, in the whispers of spies, the deceit of supposed allies, and the silent strike of a single traitor. The greatest empire in the ancient world wasn't destroyed by enemy armies, a voice might say, but by one invisible hand moving silently in the shadows. Before we uncover this shocking betrayal, I want to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments below. And if you love untold spy stories like this one, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow history lovers, and subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear might change everything you thought you knew about Alexander the Great. The story of Alexander is a tale the world has heard countless times. The meteoric rise of a young warrior king who inherited his father's throne and went on to conquer most of the known world. He was only 20 years old when he became king of Macedon, following the assassination of his father, King Philip II. Many celebrated his ascension, but others suspected foul play even then. Some historians have long speculated that Alexander's own mother, Olympias, was involved in Philip's death to ensure her son's rise. From the very beginning, Alexander's world was one of power struggles and silent conspiracies. As he expanded his empire, Alexander surrounded himself with trusted generals and companions. These were men who had marched with him for years, who shared in his victories and his spoils. They dined with him, advised him, and swore loyalty to him. But beneath this outward display of unity, tensions simmered. Each general had his own ambitions, his own lands and titles, and his own private grudges. Alexander himself was brilliant and charismatic, but also paranoid. He executed close friends on mere suspicion of treachery, and he began to believe that only he was worthy of ruling his empire. This paranoia wasn't unfounded. In an empire so vast, communication was a weapon. Spies operated at every level of Alexander's court, messengers carrying false orders, advisors whispering poisoned lies, and servants paid to listen and report what they heard. Alexander had relied heavily on this intelligence network to outmaneuver his enemies. But what he didn't realize was that his own network had been infiltrated. Somewhere among his inner circle was a spy, a figure who did not serve Alexander, but rather another master, a rival who saw the young king not as a god, but as a threat to be eliminated. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon after years of relentless campaigning. His armies were weary, his generals restless, and his court buzzing with rumors. Some whispered that Alexander planned to launch a new campaign, this time to conquer Arabia, while others feared he might declare himself a literal god and demand worship from all his subjects. These fears created cracks in his leadership, cracks that a clever spy could exploit. One man in particular has been the focus of suspicion for centuries. Antipater, the regent Alexander had left behind in Macedonia to govern Greece, while he waged war abroad. Antipater was a skilled politician with powerful connections. Though Alexander had once trusted him, their relationship had soured over time. Antipater's position grew precarious as Alexander's ambitions grew, and historians believe he may have seen only one way to protect his own power, by ending Alexander's life. And Antipater had resources. He controlled armies, wealth, and most importantly, a network of agents and informants scattered throughout the empire. If anyone had the means to reach Alexander's inner circle, it was him. His sons, Cassander and Iollas, were both stationed near Alexander, perfectly positioned to influence events. In fact, some ancient accounts specifically name Iollas, who served as Alexander's cupbearer, as the one who delivered the fatal poison. If true, this would mean the king's closest servant, the man trusted to pour his wine and guard against treachery, was himself a traitor planted by Antipater. The tension reached its peak during a grand banquet held in Babylon. It was a night of celebration, a feast to honor the gods and the victories of the past decade. Alexander, always eager to display his wealth and power, drank deeply, toasting his companions and speaking of future conquests. But as the night wore on, something shifted. According to historical records, Alexander suddenly clutched his stomach in agony. His body trembled, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. Servants rushed to his aid, but his condition only worsened. Within hours, the once mighty king could barely stand. Over the next few days, his fever rose, and he began to slip in and out of consciousness. His generals gathered around him, each man vying for control, whispering about succession plans, even as their king lay dying. The official story claims Alexander succumbed to illness, perhaps malaria or typhoid fever, but others, even at the time, believed he had been poisoned. The suddenness of his decline, the timing of the banquet, and the convenient presence of those who stood to benefit most from his death, all pointed to foul play. And if he was poisoned, it would have required careful planning, access to rare toxins, and above all, an insider with the king's complete trust. As Alexander lay on his deathbed, unable to speak, his generals asked him who should succeed him. Legend says his final words were, "To the strongest." But some accounts suggest a far darker ending, that Alexander tried to reveal the identity of his betrayer, only to be silenced before he could speak. Whether this is true or not, one fact remains undeniable: the Spies' mission was complete. The moment Alexander breathed his last, the empire he had built began to fracture. His generals, now free of his control, turned on one another in a series of brutal conflicts known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Millions would die as they tore the empire apart, fighting over the scraps of Alexander's legacy. In the end, the Spies' act of betrayal did not just kill a king, it changed the course of history forever. This is only the beginning of our investigation into Alexander's mysterious death and the shadowy figures who may have orchestrated it. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper into the tangled web of deception inside Alexander's court and reveal how spies manipulated the most powerful empire of the ancient world from within. But before we continue, remember to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an untold spy story like this one. The golden city of Babylon shimmered under the scorching sun, its towering ziggurats and lush gardens hiding a world of intrigue beneath their beauty. As Alexander's armies celebrated their return, the court was alive with whispers, rumors swirling like smoke in the corridors of the royal palace. On the surface, it seemed like a time of triumph. The great king had conquered every enemy who dared challenge him, and now he stood poised to launch new campaigns that would extend his rule even further. But beneath the celebrations, a quiet storm was brewing. Inside this vast and complex empire, loyalty was a fragile illusion. Alexander had spent years forging alliances through marriage, promises, and displays of power, but many of those closest to him were men with their own ambitions. They were generals, governors, and courtiers who owed their positions to Alexander, but who secretly dreamed of ruling in his place. And there was one group in particular whose influence reached further than Alexander ever realized: the spies of the Macedonian court. These were not simple messengers or informants. They were highly trained agents, skilled in deception, disguise, and the careful art of whispering just enough to cause chaos. Their network stretched across the empire, from Greece to Egypt to the newly conquered territories in India. Some were motivated by money, others by revenge, and still others by sheer political ambition. Alexander himself had relied on this network during his campaigns. His brilliant victories at places like Gaugamela and Tyre were possible because of intelligence gathered by spies, who reported enemy troop movements, sabotaged supplies, and spread false information to confuse his rivals. In many ways, spies were the invisible army behind his visible one. But the same network that had secured Alexander's victories also made him vulnerable. If even one spy turned against him, they could feed him lies, mislead his generals, or deliver the fatal blow when the time was right. Alexander's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. Among the many figures in Alexander's court, two men stood out as especially dangerous: Antipater and his son Cassander. Antipater was no ordinary courtier. He had been Alexander's father's most trusted advisor, and when Alexander departed to conquer Persia, he was left behind to govern Macedonia and Greece as regent. This was a position of enormous power and enormous temptation. As Alexander's conquests expanded, Antipater's influence began to wane. Reports suggest Alexander planned to replace him with someone more loyal, perhaps even executing him to prevent rebellion. For Antipater, the writing on the wall was clear. If Alexander returned to Greece, his own life and legacy were in danger. And so, according to some historical theories, he began to plan a desperate move, one that would preserve his power and free him from Alexander's shadow forever. Cassander, Antipater's ambitious son, became the perfect agent for this plot. Unlike his father, Cassander was physically present at Alexander's court, giving him direct access to the king's inner circle. Though outwardly respectful, Cassander reportedly despised Alexander, mocking his divine claims and resenting his arrogance. There is even a story of Cassander laughing at Alexander's rituals, only to be struck with fear when Alexander noticed, a moment that planted seeds of hatred in his heart. By Cassander's side was his brother Iolaus, who held a position of unparalleled intimacy with Alexander. He was the king's cupbearer, responsible for pouring his wine and tasting it for poison. In other words, Iolaus was the one person Alexander trusted completely to protect him from treachery. If this trust were betrayed, the results would be catastrophic. The tension within the court was reaching a breaking point. Alexander's dreams were growing ever larger. He spoke openly of uniting his empire under a single divine ruler himself, and even began adopting Persian customs that deeply angered his Macedonian companions. He encouraged intermarriage between his soldiers and Persian women, blending cultures in a way that many saw as a threat to traditional Macedonian values. This cultural shift created factions within the court. Some of Alexander's men embraced his vision, while others saw it as madness. Paranoia took root. Alexander began executing even his closest friends on suspicion of treason, including Parmenion, one of his most loyal generals. This sent shockwaves through the ranks. If even Parmenion wasn't safe, no one was. It was the perfect environment for a spy to thrive. A single whisper could pit one general against another. A forged letter could incite rebellion. A planted prophecy could sway Alexander's decisions. And as these tensions escalated, Alexander became more isolated, relying only on a handful of trusted individuals, a fatal mistake, as one of those individuals may have been the very traitor plotting his downfall. The most mysterious figure in this story wasn't a general or a governor, but a priest from a distant temple. Ancient sources mention a strange prophecy delivered to Alexander shortly before his final illness. The prophecy claimed that Babylon would be fatal to him and warned him not to enter the city. But Alexander, ever the fearless conqueror, dismissed the warning. Some historians believe this prophecy may have been deliberately planted by spies to unsettle him or distract him from the true danger lurking closer to home. If Alexander believed his fate lay in the city itself, he might focus his attention outward while the real threat came from someone at his very side. This was the brilliance of ancient espionage, misdirection. While Alexander worried about foreign assassins or divine omens, the true weapon was already in his hands, his own trusted cupbearer. The final days before the banquet were marked by strange events. A shipment of exotic goods arrived from Greece, including rare herbs and wines meant as gifts. No one questioned their origin, as gifts for the king were common. But according to later accounts, hidden among these goods was a vial of deadly poison, so potent that even a drop could kill a man within days. If this story is true, then the plan was both simple and devastatingly effective. The poison would be mixed into Alexander's wine during a grand feast when suspicion would be at its lowest. Everyone would assume that any illness was natural, brought on by exhaustion or foreign disease. By the time doubts arose, it would be far too late. On the night of the banquet, the hall was filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets. Alexander, always eager to display his strength, drank deeply as he toasted his companions. Iolaus, standing dutifully by his side, poured the wine with steady hands. To the watching crowd, it was a scene of loyalty and tradition. To history, it may have been the exact moment the ancient world shifted forever. As the night wore on, Alexander began to feel unwell. At first, it was subtle, a wave of nausea, a slight chill, but soon his condition deteriorated rapidly. He collapsed, clutching his stomach, and the room descended into chaos. Servants rushed forward, generals shouted orders, and Cassander's face reportedly turned pale with either guilt or fear. The physicians who attended Alexander were baffled. His symptoms didn't match any known illness. Within hours, the mighty conqueror was bedridden, his once commanding voice reduced to whispers. The empire's leaders gathered around him, each man already plotting his next move. If you had been there that night, standing in Alexander's court as he fell gravely ill, would you have trusted those around you, or begun to suspect everyone of betrayal? As the empire's greatest figure lay dying, the question of succession loomed large. Without a clear heir, chaos was inevitable. But what no one yet realized was that this chaos had been carefully orchestrated. Whether by Antipater, Cassander, or some other shadowy figure, the plan was already in motion, and the greatest spy operation of the ancient world was about to reach its devastating climax. The whispers in Babylon were no longer just rumors. They were weapons, and they were about to tear an empire apart. The palace of Babylon had fallen into a tense, suffocating silence. Only days earlier, its marble halls had echoed with the laughter of soldiers and the triumphant music of victory. Now, those same halls were filled with dread. Servants moved like ghosts, careful not to speak too loudly or make sudden movements, while the generals of the greatest empire on earth watched each other with suspicion. In a chamber guarded by the elite royal guard, Alexander the Great lay dying. His once mighty body, which had endured countless battles and impossible marches, now trembled with fever and weakness. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, flickered with a mix of rage and confusion. To the outside world, it looked like the young king had been struck by some mysterious illness. But inside these walls, those who knew him best understood the truth. Though none dared speak it aloud, this was no natural sickness. It was a silent, invisible strike, the perfect work of a spy. The decline of Alexander's health was both rapid and strangely deliberate. After the banquet, where he had drunk deeply from the wine poured by his trusted cupbearer, Iolaus, the symptoms began subtly. At first, Alexander complained of a burning sensation in his stomach, then an unbearable fever. As hours passed, his condition worsened until he could no longer stand. His voice grew hoarse, his breathing labored. Physicians tried everything they knew, poultices, herbs, incantations, but nothing worked. Each remedy seemed to make him weaker. It was as if some unseen hand was pulling the life out of him, drop by drop. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread through the palace. Some said the gods had finally turned against him for declaring himself divine. Others believed it was punishment for destroying the great city of Persepolis, or for adopting Persian customs that angered his Macedonian companions. But among those closest to him, a darker rumor took hold: poison. The idea was terrifying, not because it was unthinkable, but because it was all too possible. Alexander's position made him a target for countless enemies, both foreign and domestic. And poison, unlike open rebellion, left no armies to fight, no traitors to execute. It was the perfect weapon, especially when delivered by someone the victim trusted completely. The court quickly descended into chaos. Each general suspected the others, and alliances began to form and fracture in mere hours. Men who had fought side by side for years now eyed one another like predators circling wounded prey. Every glance, every whispered conversation became suspicious. Cassander, Antipater's son, stood at the center of this storm. Ancient historians describe his behavior as nervous and erratic. He reportedly fled Babylon shortly after Alexander's death, a fact many interpret as guilt. Others believe he stayed just long enough to ensure his father's plans succeeded before retreating to safety. As for Ayala's, the cupbearer whose hands may have delivered the poison, accounts vary. Some claim he disappeared into obscurity, protected by powerful patrons. Others suggest he was quietly executed before he could reveal the full conspiracy. Either way, the truth was buried as carefully as Alexander's own body would soon be. The most chilling aspect of this plot was how precisely timed it had been. Alexander had been preparing to launch a new campaign, one that would take him into Arabia and perhaps beyond. His generals were weary, his soldiers homesick, and many of his advisors opposed the plan. By striking at this exact moment, the conspirators ensured maximum chaos. If Alexander had been assassinated during a battle, his army might have united in grief and vengeance. But by killing him quietly, in the heart of his own palace, they turned unity into paranoia. No one knew who to trust. No one even knew for certain that it was murder. And while they hesitated, the empire began to unravel. As Alexander's condition worsened, he reportedly realized what was happening. Some ancient accounts describe a dramatic scene in which he tried to speak, to name his killer, but his voice failed him. Others say he handed his royal signet ring to one of his generals, a symbolic act meant to designate a successor, or perhaps to signal suspicion. A tragedy is that no one could be sure. Even in his final moments, the lies were so thick that the truth itself sounded like deception. Do you think Alexander realized he had been betrayed, or did he die believing he was still invincible? Drop your thoughts in the comments. History may never give us the answer, but your theory might. When word spread through the city that the great king was on the brink of death, panic rippled through the streets. Babylon's merchants, soldiers, and citizens all knew that Alexander's empire was held together by his will alone. Without him, there would be no unifying force, no single authority. The vast territories he had conquered, Greece, Egypt, Persia, and beyond, would descend into chaos. And that chaos was precisely what the conspirators wanted. A fractured empire would be easier to control. While the generals fought among themselves, the spy who struck the final blow could move unseen, rewriting the fate of nations from the shadows. Inside the palace, the tension reached a breaking point. The generals gathered around Alexander's bed, their voices rising in heated argument. Who would succeed him? His unborn child by Roxana? His half-brother Aridaeus, who was known to be mentally unfit? Or one of them, chosen by strength alone? Alexander, his strength fading, is said to have whispered a single phrase when asked whom he would leave his empire to. To the strongest. This cryptic answer threw the court into even deeper turmoil. Did he mean the physically strongest general? The most politically powerful? Or was it a final act of defiance? A way to ensure they would tear each other apart after his death? Whatever his intent, the words became a prophecy. The generals would soon wage a series of brutal conflicts known as the Wars of the Diadochi, fighting not just for power, but for survival. As Alexander finally slipped into silence, the spies' work was done. The poison, whether literal or symbolic, had done its job. The greatest conqueror the world had ever seen was gone, and his empire was already splintering. Somewhere, perhaps in Macedonia, Antipater received word of the king's death. Whether he smiled in triumph or shuddered at the chaos he'd unleashed, history does not tell us. But one thing is certain. The spy who betrayed Alexander didn't just kill a man. They killed an idea. For centuries, historians have debated the truth. Was it Antipater's plot? Was it the work of foreign enemies, like the Persians or Babylonians? Or was it simply fate, a natural illness striking at the worst possible moment? We may never know the answer, but as long as the question remains, the story of Alexander's death will haunt history. A mystery written in blood, betrayal, and whispers. Alexander's death was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with war, treachery, and the final unmasking of the spy who brought an empire to its knees. In the next and final chapter, we will witness how Alexander's generals turned on each other, how his vast empire splintered into warring kingdoms, and how the shadow of this assassination shaped the ancient world for centuries to come. The morning after Alexander the Great drew his final breath, the city of Babylon awoke to a silence so profound it felt unnatural. For years, this city had been the beating heart of an unstoppable empire. Its streets had pulsed with the movement of soldiers, merchants, and priests, all united under one ruler. Now, that unity had vanished. Inside the palace, the once grand hall, where Alexander had held councils of war, was now a battlefield of words and ambition. His generals, men who had marched beside him across deserts and through mountains, who had conquered kingdoms and defied the gods, now stood face to face as rivals. The mighty empire Alexander had built, stretching from Greece to Egypt and all the way to the edges of India, had been held together not by laws or traditions, but by his singular will. And with him gone, there was nothing left to keep it whole. The poison, whether slipped into his wine by a trusted cupbearer or delivered through more subtle means, had done more than kill a man. It had shattered a delicate balance of power. Whispers of betrayal spread through the court like wildfire. Some pointed fingers at Cassander, son of Antipater, who had been present at the banquet. Others accused Alexander's generals of orchestrating the plot together, each hoping to seize the throne. But the true mastermind, the shadowy spy whose hand guided it all, remained hidden, protected by layers of deception. While the generals argued, the empire began to fracture. Provinces that had once bowed to Alexander now questioned their loyalty. Governors and satraps, sensing weakness, prepared to declare independence. The Persian nobles Alexander had integrated into his court began plotting to reclaim their former glory. The dream of a unified empire was collapsing before anyone could even bury its creator. At the center of this storm was Roxana, Alexander's wife and queen. She was pregnant, and her unborn child represented a fragile hope for a legitimate heir. But even this hope became a weapon. Some generals vowed to protect Roxana and her child, while others saw them as obstacles to be eliminated. In a chilling twist of fate, Roxana herself would later murder Alexander's other wives, ensuring her child would be the sole heir, an act of desperation that only deepened the cycle of bloodshed and betrayal. With no clear leader, Alexander's most powerful generals, the Diadochi, or successors, carved the empire into pieces. Ptolemy seized Egypt, founding a dynasty that would last for centuries. Seleucus took the eastern provinces, creating the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus claimed Asia Minor, while Lysimachus took Thrace. Each man declared himself the true heir to Alexander's legacy, even as they secretly plotted against one another. The spy who had struck the first blow had unleashed a war without end. These conflicts became known as the Wars of the Diadochi, a series of brutal campaigns that lasted decades. Cities were burned, populations slaughtered, and ancient cultures wiped out as these former comrades fought for dominance. Ironically, the very men who had once relied on Alexander's spy network now turned to espionage themselves. Assassinations, forged letters, and secret alliances became as important as open battle. The shadow world of spies had grown so powerful that sometimes a single whispered lie decided the fate of an entire army. In this way, the legacy of the spy who killed Alexander lived on. They had proven that empires could fall not just through force, but through secrets. As Babylon descended into chaos, there was one final moment of eerie symbolism. When Alexander's body was prepared for burial, a dispute erupted over where he should be laid to rest. Tradition demanded he be returned to Macedonia, but Ptolemy, ever the strategist, intercepted the funeral procession and brought the body to Egypt, where it would become a powerful political symbol. Even in death, Alexander was a pawn in someone else's game. His body was paraded through the streets of Alexandria, not as a tribute to the man he had been, but as a statement of power by those who now ruled in his name. It was as if the spy's final act was to ensure that Alexander himself would never truly rest, his empire and his legacy forever torn apart by the betrayal that had ended his life. Centuries later, historians would debate the truth. Was Alexander truly poisoned, or was his death simply the result of exhaustion and disease? Was Antipater the mastermind, or merely a convenient suspect? Or was the real culprit someone history never recorded, a shadow, moving silently through the court, erasing their tracks as they went? The lack of answers is, perhaps, the greatest clue of all. After all, a perfect spy leaves no evidence behind. The assassination of Alexander the Great is more than just a story of one man's death. It is a lesson in how fragile empires truly are. One whisper, one carefully planted seed of doubt, one drop of poison, it is all it takes to bring even the mightiest kingdom to its knees. The world remembers Alexander as a conqueror who changed the map forever. But perhaps the real power lay not with the man who commanded armies, but with the unseen hand that ended his reign. And with that, the spy's empire of secrets finally collapsed, leaving a legacy written in betrayal. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, smash that like button, share this video with someone who loves untold spy stories, and subscribe right now, because the next ancient spy case we uncover might be even more shocking and may just rewrite everything you thought you knew about history.